The girl came to the ranch at dusk, barefoot, hair tangled like it had been torn apart by the wind itself. People in town called her mad, whispered her name like it carried a curse, said grief had snapped her mind in half the night her baby died during childbirth. Since then, she wandered the outskirts, speaking to shadows, clutching empty blankets, begging God for a miracle that never came. The rancher had heard the stories but never believed them, not until she stood at his gate, eyes burning with something that was not madness but pain sharpened into obsession. "I need a child," she said, voice trembling yet firm, as if it were the only truth left in the world. He laughed nervously at first, thinking she meant work, shelter, help of some kind. But she stepped closer, hands shaking, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. She spoke of nights screaming into the dark, of a womb that felt like a grave, of a town that mocked her prayers. The rancher froze when he finally understood her meaning, not because of desire, but because he saw how far gone she truly was. He turned away, told her to leave, told her this was madness. But she followed him into the barn, fell to her knees, begged him with a broken dignity that crushed his chest. She promised nothing but silence, nothing but disappearance after, said she would carry the burden alone if only God would give her another chance. The rancher had buried his wife years ago, buried his own unborn child with her, and the wound never healed. Her words ripped open scars he had learned to live with. Still, he refused. He believed some lines could never be crossed. He locked the barn, watched her walk into the night, and told himself it was over. But the wind carried her sobs across the fields, and that sound followed him into his sleep. By morning, the town was already whispering again, saying the mad girl had tried to shame him, saying he should have chased her off with a rifle. He said nothing. But inside, something was cracking. He remembered his wife's empty arms. He remembered praying for a child that never came. And for the first time since the grave, he wondered if God sometimes asked men to do terrible things for merciful reasons. As the sun climbed higher, the rancher realized the girl hadn't asked out of desire, but survival. And that realization terrified him more than her madness ever could. 3 days passed before he saw her again, collapsed near the creek, feverish, clutching a ragged doll made from old cloth. The town doctor said she wouldn't last the winter. That grief had hollowed her out. That hope was the only thing keeping her breathing. That night, the rancher sat alone, staring at the photograph of his wife, asking forgiveness from a woman who could no longer answer. At dawn, he did the unthinkable, but not in the way the town would later accuse him of. He rode into town, sold half his land, and returned with papers no one expected. He went to the orphanage 2 counties away, where unwanted children waited behind locked smiles, and chose a newborn girl no one else wanted. When the mad girl woke, he placed the child in her arms without a word. She screamed at first, then froze, then wept so hard her body shook like it might split apart. "She's yours," the rancher said. "Not mine, no debt, no secret." The town erupted when they heard. Some called him a fool. Others called him worse. But the girl, no longer mad, no longer wandering, stood tall for the first time in years. Motherhood healed what pity never could. And the rancher? He walked back to his empty house, poorer in land but richer in peace. Years later, when the child ran through his fields laughing, calling him uncle, the town fell silent, because the unthinkable thing he had done wasn't sin. It was sacrifice. And sometimes the greatest redemption doesn't come from desire, but from choosing compassion when cruelty is easier. The town never forgave easily. Weeks after the child arrived, eyes followed the mad girl, no, the woman, wherever she went. Some still whispered her old name like a warning. Others crossed the street when she passed, but she didn't shrink anymore. She walked straight, the child pressed to her chest like a shield made of flesh and breath. Motherhood had anchored her mind, given shape to thoughts that once scattered like birds startled by gunfire. She spoke calmly now, worked with focus, sang to the baby in the evenings while the sun bled into the horizon. The rancher watched from a distance, careful not to intrude, careful not to claim what was never meant to be his. Yet he felt something unfamiliar growing inside him. Not longing, but responsibility. He repaired her roof without asking, left food at her door, fixed the fence she never could. The town noticed. Judgment softened into confusion, then into quiet respect. But peace never lasts long in places built on gossip. One night, a preacher arrived from the south, declaring the arrangement unnatural, claiming sin hid beneath charity. He stirred old hatred, told the townsfolk that madness never truly healed. That child, he warned, would be cursed. The woman stood before the church the next morning, voice steady, eyes clear, and told them her child was not born of shame, but saved from abandonment. The rancher stood beside her, silent, unmoving. And for the first time, the town understood that whatever unthinkable thing had been done, it had created life, not destroyed it. Winter came hard that year. Snow buried fences. Hunger crept into houses like a thief. The orphanage the child came from burned down in a storm, killing 3 caretakers and leaving dozens of children scattered across counties. The news struck the woman like lightning. She spent nights awake, rocking the child, whispering prayers for the ones left behind. Guilt returned, not madness, but survivor's guilt, heavy and sharp. She asked the rancher why her child had been spared. He had no answer, only silence and work. When sickness spread through town, it was the woman who nursed the dying, the one they once feared. When food ran low, the rancher slaughtered his last cattle and fed families without payment. Slowly, a truth settled over the land. Redemption doesn't arrive clean, it arrives worn, tired and willing to bleed. One night, the woman confessed her darkest fear, that if anything happened to the child, her mind would shatter again. The rancher listened, then did something else unthinkable. He changed his will, left her the ranch, left the child a future. Not because I owe you, he said, but because the world owes her a chance. She wept, not from pain, but from being seen. Years passed. The child grew strong, sharp-eyed, curious. She asked questions about everything, especially about where she came from. The woman told her the truth, not as a wound, but as a story of rescue. The child listened, wide-eyed, then asked if the rancher was her father. The question froze the air. The rancher knelt, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "No, I'm something else. I'm the man who made sure you lived." The answer satisfied her. Children understand truth when adults stop hiding it. The town, once cruel, now depended on them. The ranch became a refuge in drought and flood alike. And yet peace always demands payment. One evening, riders arrived, men who claimed the land was never his to give, that papers could be challenged, that the child's place there was fragile. The rancher stood firm. The woman stood firmer. This time she did not beg. She fought, with words, with proof, with a strength born from surviving her own collapse. When the men left, defeated, the rancher realized something quietly devastating. She no longer needed saving, and that, somehow, felt like the greatest success of his life. The rancher died in his sleep on a spring morning, hands folded like he'd finally rested. The town gathered, not out of duty, but gratitude. The woman stood beside the grave with her grown daughter, wind lifting their hair like the past trying one last time to speak. There were no secrets left to haunt them. Only truth. The preacher who once condemned them lowered his head in silence. The ranch passed as promised. Years later, the daughter would tell the story to her own children, not of madness, not of scandal, but of a man who refused to let grief turn him cruel, of a woman who demanded life when the world offered only pity, and of an unthinkable choice that rewrote every destiny it touched. Some said the rancher had played God. Others said he'd simply listened when God spoke, through suffering. But everyone agreed on one thing. That day, compassion won. Time softened the land. But it never erased the story. Long after the rancher's grave settled into grass, travelers came asking about him. Some had heard rumors about a mad girl, an orphan child, an act that defied reason. The woman, now older, stronger, carried those questions with grace. She no longer flinched at her past. Instead, she owned it. She taught the child, now a young woman, how pain could either rot a soul or refine it. Together, they rebuilt the ranch into something more than land and cattle. It became a place of second chances. Runaways found work. Widows found shelter. Children without names found belonging. People said the rancher's spirit lingered there, not as a ghost, but as a standard. What would he have done? became a question people asked before choosing cruelty. One night, the woman stood alone on the porch, remembering the day she begged. She realized then that desperation had not been her weakness. It had been her honesty. And the world had answered, not through miracles, but through a man brave enough to act without needing credit. Years later, when the daughter had children of her own, she brought them to the old grave beneath the oak tree. She told them the full truth, not softened, not dramatic. She said a man once faced a choice that could have destroyed his reputation, his comfort, his peace, and he chose compassion anyway. Remember this, she told them. The unthinkable is not always evil. Sometimes it's simply courage wearing the wrong name. The children listened quietly, sensing the weight of the story. As the sun dipped low, the wind moved through the grass the way it always had, steady and forgiving. The woman closed her eyes, finally free of the voice that once screamed inside her. She had her child. She had her life. And the rancher, though gone, had left behind something greater than blood or legacy. He left proof that one selfless act can echo louder than a lifetime of fear. And that is how the story ended, not with madness, not with scandal, but with a truth the world rarely admits. Sometimes the right thing looks unthinkable, until it saves everyone.